You think the justice system is blind, but sometimes the monster holding the gavel is looking right at you. Judge Harlan Whitaker had built a 30-year career destroying lives from his elevated bench, targeting minorities with maximum sentences and a cold, prejudiced smirk. He thought he was untouchable. He thought the quiet black man brought into his courtroom on trumped-up charges was just another statistic, another life to ruin before lunch. But he was dead wrong. He did not know he had just planted a stolen weapon on an elite undercover FBI operative. The trap was set, and the karma that followed was absolutely devastating. The heavy oak doors of Courtroom 4 in the heart of the Federal District always felt like the gates of a medieval dungeon. To the locals of this sprawling, rusted-out industrial county, those doors represented a one-way trip. The man presiding over this domain was Judge Harlan Whitaker. At 62 years old, Whitaker was a relic of a bygone, uglier era. He had silver hair slicked back with expensive pomade, a face like cracked leather, and eyes the color of dirty ice. He had built his entire political and judicial career on a simple, unspoken platform, keeping the undesirables in line. Behind closed doors, his language was much less sanitized. Whitaker's reputation for handing down wildly disproportionate sentences to Black and Hispanic defendants was an open secret in the legal community. Public defenders dreaded his courtroom. Prosecutors, at least the ambitious ones, knew that if they brought a person of color into Whitaker's domain, a conviction was practically gift-wrapped, regardless of the evidence. He was arrogant, deeply racist, and entirely convinced of his own invincibility. Why would he not be? Decades of complaints to the Judicial Review Board had mysteriously vanished, buried by a network of corrupt local officials and old boys club politicians who valued his tough-on-crime statistics. On a muggy morning, the docket was packed. Sitting quietly in the holding cell behind the courtroom was a man booked under the name Desmond Bradley. Desmond was 34, solidly built, wearing faded denim and a cheap, slightly torn jacket. He had been pulled over a few nights earlier for a broken taillight, a classic pretext stop. What followed was a masterclass in local police harassment. Deputy Nolan Briggs, one of Whitaker's favored local enforcers, had dragged Desmond out of his vehicle, searched him without a warrant, and claimed to have found a small bag of narcotics on the pavement next to the car. Desmond maintained his silence throughout the arrest, which only infuriated Briggs. But Desmond Bradley did not exist. Beneath the scuffed boots, the carefully cultivated 5 o'clock shadow, and the quiet, submissive demeanor, sat Special Agent Marcus Ross of the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Public Corruption Unit. Ross was a decorated, brilliant operative, handpicked from the Washington field office for a highly classified sting. The FBI had finally accumulated enough whispers, anonymous tips, and statistical anomalies to launch a covert probe into Whitaker's district, but they needed irrefutable proof. They needed Whitaker on tape, crossing the line from biased judge to active, malicious criminal. Ross sat on the cold metal bench of the holding cell, adjusting his posture. Embedded seamlessly into the button of his flannel shirt was a microscopic, high-definition camera. Sewn into the seam of his collar was a highly sensitive audio transmitter, currently broadcasting a crystal-clear feed to an unmarked black surveillance van parked 3 blocks away in a dilapidated parking garage. "Comms check. Marcus, we have you loud and clear." The voice of Supervisory Special Agent Elena Jenkins murmured into Ross's microscopic earpiece. "Whitaker just took the bench. Briggs is in the room. Stay frosty." "Copy that," Ross whispered, barely moving his lips. When the bailiff finally called the name Desmond Bradley, Ross was escorted out of the holding area and into the brightly lit, suffocating atmosphere of Courtroom 4. The air conditioning was broken, but Judge Whitaker looked perfectly comfortable in his heavy black robes, looking down from his elevated bench like a hawk spotting a field mouse. As Ross stood before the judge, flanked by an overworked public defender who looked like he had not slept in days, Whitaker peered over his reading glasses. The sheer contempt in the judge's eyes was palpable. It was not just professional detachment, It was deeply personal, visceral disgust. "Desmond Bradley," Whitaker drawled, his voice a low, raspy baritone that echoed off the wood-paneled walls. He flipped through the arrest report with exaggerated slowness. Possession of a controlled substance, resisting arrest, and a prior record from out of state. It seems, Mr. Bradley, you have decided to bring your particular brand of lawlessness into my county. Your Honor? The public defender stammered, adjusting his tie. My client asserts his innocence. The traffic stop was highly irregular, and the dashcam footage from Deputy Briggs's cruiser has conveniently malfunctioned. Whitaker let out a dry, mocking chuckle. Is that so, Counselor? A malfunction? How convenient for your client to allege a conspiracy the moment he is caught red-handed. Whitaker shifted his gaze back to Ross. Bail is denied. I consider this defendant a severe flight risk and a danger to this community. Ross kept his head down, playing the part of the defeated, marginalized victim perfectly. But inside, his pulse remained a steady 60 beats per minute. Take the bait, Harlan, Ross thought. Show me who you really are. Remand him, Whitaker ordered the bailiff, slamming his gavel. And let us schedule a preliminary hearing. I want this trash processed quickly. As Ross was led away, he locked eyes with Deputy Briggs, who was leaning against the gallery railing, smirking. Ross let his shoulders slump, giving them exactly what they wanted to see. A broken man. But the operation had successfully cleared its first hurdle. He was in the system. Now he just had to let the corrupt machine try to grind him down. The corruption in Oak Haven County did not just stop at biased rulings. It was an active, coordinated enterprise. Judge Harlan Whitaker was not merely a bigot. He was a sadist who took immense pleasure in actively destroying the lives of people he deemed inferior. Desmond Bradley, with his quiet defiance and out-of-state plates, had gotten under Whitaker's skin. The judge wanted to make an example out of him. One evening, the courthouse was mostly empty. The janitorial staff was buffing the hallway floors, the rhythmic hum of the machines echoing through the quiet corridors. Inside Judge Whitaker's lavish private chambers, the air was thick with the smell of expensive bourbon and stale cigar smoke. Whitaker sat behind his massive mahogany desk, pouring 2 glasses of amber liquid. Across from him sat Deputy Nolan Briggs. He is quiet, Harlan, Briggs said, taking the glass. Too quiet. Usually these guys are screaming about their rights or crying for their mamas. Bradley just sits there staring at the wall. Whitaker took a slow sip of his bourbon, leaning back in his leather chair. It is the quiet ones you have to break properly, Nolan. It is a matter of principle. We cannot have his kind thinking they can just waltz into our town, peddle their poison, and get a slap on the wrist. But Whitaker paused, swishing the liquor in his glass. A simple possession charge. He might plead out. He might get a sympathetic appellate judge later on. It is too weak. Briggs frowned. I did what I could. I dropped the baggie by his boot. It is enough for a solid 5 years if you max him out. 5 years is a vacation. Whitaker sneered, his true venom leaking out. I want him buried. I want him in a maximum security state penitentiary until his hair turns gray. We need an enhancement, a serious one. Briggs looked uneasy. Like what? Whitaker stood up, walking over to a heavy iron safe tucked in the corner of his office behind a large American flag. He spun the dial, the tumblers clicking loudly in the quiet room. He pulled open the heavy metal door and reached inside. When he turned around, he was holding a snub-nosed .38 revolver wrapped inside a clear plastic evidence bag. This, Whitaker said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, was recovered from a gang shooting 3 counties over about 4 years ago. The serial number is filed off. The case went cold. It is a ghost gun. Briggs's eyes widened. Harlan, you want to pin a gun charge on him? That is federal time. If we get caught... Caught by who, Nolan? Whitaker barked, slamming the gun down on the desk. I am the law in this building. Who is going to question a routine inventory search of the defendant's impounded vehicle? You are going to go back to the impound lot tonight. You are going to find this weapon tucked up under the driver's side dashboard, armed during the commission of a felony that carries a mandatory minimum that will put Mr. Bradley away for 20 years. No parole. Briggs stared at the weapon, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. You are sure about this? I have done it before, and I will do it again, Whitaker said smoothly, walking around the desk to clap Briggs on the shoulder. Think of it as community service. We are taking out the trash, and quite frankly, I do not like the way that boy looked at me in my courtroom. He needs to learn his place. What neither Whitaker nor Briggs knew was that their entire conversation was not as private as they believed. Months prior to Ross's undercover insertion, an FBI black bag team had breached the courthouse during a supposed weekend plumbing emergency. They had installed state-of-the-art, undetectable fiber optic cameras and microphones inside Whitaker's chambers. One was hidden inside the binding of a thick legal dictionary on the bookshelf. Another was integrated into the casing of the wall clock directly facing the judge's desk. 3 blocks away in the surveillance van, Agent Elena Jenkins and a team of 4 technicians watched the high-definition feed in absolute silence. The glow of the monitors illuminated their tense faces. We got him, a young tech whispered, adjusting his headphones as if he could not believe what he was hearing. He just handed over a drop piece. He explicitly ordered the planting of evidence. Do not celebrate yet, Jenkins said, her eyes narrowed at the screen. We have the conspiracy now. We need to let the crime happen. We need to catch Briggs planting it, and we need Whitaker to admit it into the official court record. Once he brings that gavel down, the trap snaps shut on his neck. B-Sox. She pressed the comms button. Marcus, do you copy? The target has taken the bait. I repeat, Whitaker has authorized an evidence plant. A .38 revolver is heading to your impounded vehicle. In his holding cell, Marcus Ross lay on his cot, staring at the ceiling. When he heard Jenkins' voice in his earpiece, a cold, hard smile touched his lips. Copy, Ross murmured into his collar. Let them dig the hole a little deeper. The morning of the preliminary hearing arrived with a heavy, oppressive heat that seeped through the thick stone walls of the courthouse. The courtroom was fuller today. Word had trickled down through the courthouse gossip mill that Deputy Briggs had found a surprise in the suspect's vehicle. The local prosecutors were practically vibrating with anticipation. A gun charge on top of the narcotics meant an easy, high-profile conviction. Marcus Ross was escorted in, his hands cuffed in front of him. He looked suitably exhausted, his shoulders hunched. His public defender, a man named Thomas Vance, looked visibly ill. Desmond, listen to me, Vance whispered frantically as Ross sat down at the defense table. They hit us with a superseding indictment this morning. Briggs claims he did a secondary sweep of your car and found an unregistered firearm, a .38 special. With your prior record, you are looking at a mandatory 2 decades. The DA is offering 10 years if you plead guilty right now. I highly suggest you take it. Ross looked at the public defender. The man was not necessarily corrupt, just broken by a system that Whitaker had rigged beyond repair. I am not pleading guilty to anything, Ross said, his voice calm and steady. I did not have a gun. Vance sighed, running a hand over his face. Desmond, it does not matter what you had. It matters what they can prove. And right now, they have a sworn deputy saying he found it. All rise, the bailiff shouted. Judge Whitaker swept into the room, his black robes billowing like a bat's wings. He took his seat, an air of supreme satisfaction radiating from him. He adjusted his glasses and looked down at the defense table, his eyes locking onto Ross. It was the look of a hunter who had successfully cornered his prey. Court is in session, Whitaker announced. We are here for the preliminary hearing in the matter of the state versus Desmond Bradley. Let us get right to it. The state has submitted an updated evidence log. The prosecuting attorney, an aggressive young lawyer hoping to use Whitaker's favor for a political run, stood up quickly. Yes, Your Honor. The state has entered into evidence item 4B, .38 caliber revolver found securely hidden under the dashboard of the defendant's vehicle during a routine authorized inventory search by Deputy Briggs. I see, Whitaker said, pretending to read a document he had practically memorized. A severe escalation. Mr. Bradley, drugs are one thing, but introducing untraceable firearms into my community, well, that shows a callous disregard for human life. Ross stood up slowly. Your Honor, I have never seen that gun in my life. It was not in my car. Whitaker's face hardened, contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated disdain. Mr. Bradley, you are in a court of law, not a street corner. You do not speak until you are spoken to. Your blatant lies hold no weight here. We have a sworn affidavit from a decorated law enforcement officer. An officer who illegally searched my car and then manufactured a reason to lock me up, Ross countered, raising his voice just enough to echo in the courtroom. He was purposefully pushing Whitaker's buttons, testing the limits of the judge's arrogance. Bailiff, silence the defendant! Whitaker roared, slamming his gavel so hard it chipped the woodblock beneath it. The courtroom fell deathly quiet. Whitaker leaned over the bench, his face flushed red with fury, pointing a crooked finger at Ross. You listen to me, boy, Whitaker hissed, dropping any pretense of judicial neutrality. People like you think you can come into my town and play the victim. You think you can cry racism, cry corruption, and expect the bleeding hearts to save you. Not here. Here you face the consequences of your actions. I am ruling that the firearm was obtained through a lawful inventory search. It is fully admissible, and given this new violent charge, bail remains revoked. Whitaker sat back, taking a deep breath to compose himself, smoothing his robes. We will proceed to trial in 30 days. I highly recommend your counsel explain the severity of a 20-year sentence to you in the meantime. Court is adjourned. As Whitaker banged his gavel for the final time, a sickening silence hung over the gallery. The local lawyers shook their heads. Another life ruined. Another box checked on Whitaker's crusade. But down at the defense table, Marcus Ross was not looking at the floor. He lifted his head and looked directly into Judge Whitaker's eyes. He did not look defeated. He did not look scared. He smiled. A cold, knowing, razor-sharp smile. Whitaker caught the look, and for a fraction of a second, a flicker of confusion crossed the old judge's face. Why was the dead man smiling? Subject is committed to the record. Agent Jenkins' voice crackled in Ross's ear, sharp and triumphant. The evidence is officially admitted. The conspiracy is complete. Green light, Marcus. Burn the house down. Ross slowly unclasped his cuffed hands, resting them on the wooden table. Your Honor, he said loudly, his voice completely dropping the Desmond Bradley accent, replacing it with the crisp, authoritative tone of a federal agent. Before you adjourn, there is a matter of jurisdiction we need to address. Whitaker froze halfway out of his chair. What did you just say to me? I said, Ross repeated, his voice booming through the room. There is a matter of jurisdiction because you are no longer presiding over a state criminal proceeding. You are now the primary suspect in a federal investigation. The courtroom remained frozen in a state of suspended animation. For 3 agonizing seconds, no one breathed. The air conditioning rattled above, a stark contrast to the absolute silence that had descended upon courtroom 4. What kind of stunt is this? Judge Harlan Whitaker finally spat, his face flushing a deep, mottled purple. He grabbed his gavel, raising it like a weapon. Bailiff, take this man to the holding cells immediately. I am holding you in criminal contempt, Mr. Bradley. I will add another 5 years to your sentence just for opening your mouth. The bailiff, a heavy-set man who had spent a decade doing Whitaker's dirty work, lunged forward to grab Ross by the shoulders. Before the bailiff's hands could make contact, the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom exploded open. FBI, nobody move. Hands where we can see them. The thunderous command echoed off the wood paneling as a dozen heavily armed federal agents wearing tactical vests flooded the aisles. They moved with terrifying, practiced precision, fanning out and securing all exits in seconds. The aggressive young local prosecutor dropped his legal pad, his hands shooting into the air. In the gallery, Deputy Nolan Briggs went completely rigid, his face draining of all color. Judge Whitaker stood up behind his elevated bench, his jaw dropping. What is the meaning of this? This is a state court. You have no jurisdiction here. I am the presiding judge. A woman in a sharp navy suit stepped calmly through the sea of tactical agents. It was Supervisory Special Agent Elena Jenkins. She walked directly down the center aisle, her eyes locked onto Whitaker. She bypassed the swinging wooden gates and approached the defense table. "Unlock him," Jenkins ordered the stunned bailiff, her voice like cracking ice. The bailiff fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking violently as he unlocked the handcuffs binding Marcus Ross. Ross rubbed his wrists, rolling his shoulders before reaching into his cheap torn jacket. He pulled out a leather trifold and flipped it open, revealing a gleaming gold shield. "Special Agent Marcus Ross, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Public Corruption Unit," Ross announced, his voice carrying the full weight of the federal government. He looked up at the bench, meeting Whitaker's horrified gaze. "And as of this exact moment, Harlan, you are relieved of your duties." "This is an outrage," Whitaker bellowed, though his voice cracked with a sudden underlying panic. He looked wildly around the room, realizing that his absolute authority was vaporizing before his eyes. "I will have all of your badges. I will call the governor. I will call the attorney general." "You can call whoever you would like from the federal holding facility, Harlan," Jenkins said coolly. She pulled a thick stack of folded papers from her jacket. "I have a warrant for your arrest signed by a federal magistrate judge this morning, authorized directly by the DOJ Civil Rights Division in Washington." Deputy Briggs, seeing the writing on the wall, tried to quietly back out of the side door near the jury box. "Agent Ross," Jenkins said, and without looking away from the judge, "secure the deputy." Ross vaulted over the defense table with an athletic grace that completely shattered his previous persona. Before Briggs could even reach for the doorknob, Ross slammed him against the wood paneling, pinning his arm behind his back and snapping a pair of federal flex cuffs around his wrists. "Nolan Briggs," Ross whispered into the deputy's ear, "you are under arrest for the deprivation of rights under color of law, evidence tampering, and perjury. You planted a .38 caliber revolver in my car last night." "I did not. I swear," Briggs sobbed, instantly breaking. "He made me do it. The judge made me do it. It was his gun." "Shut up, you idiot!" Whitaker screamed from the bench, spittle flying from his lips. "He is lying. The defendant is a convicted felon. This is a setup." Ross secured Briggs and walked slowly up the steps toward the judge's bench. He did not ask for permission. He stepped right up to the elevated platform, towering over the seated, trembling judge. "A setup?" Ross asked, his voice low and dangerous. "Let me tell you about a setup, Harlan. You thought you were untouchable. You thought a ghost gun with a filed-off serial number from a cold case 4 years ago could not be traced?" Whitaker's eyes widened to the size of saucers. How could they possibly know about the cold case? Ross leaned in closer. "We have had audio and visual surveillance in your private chambers for 3 months. We watched you open your safe behind the American flag. We watched you pull out that .38 special. We listened to you tell Deputy Briggs to plant it under my dashboard to trigger a mandatory 20-year sentence because you did not like the way I looked at you." Whitaker collapsed back into his leather chair as if he had been shot. The arrogant, untouchable apex predator was gone, replaced by a terrified, hollowed-out old man. Under Title 18, United States Code, Sections 241 and 242, Jenkins declared loudly for the court reporter, who was still frantically typing every word, "You are being charged with conspiracy against rights and the deprivation of rights under color of law. Because your conspiracy included an attempt to falsely imprison an agent of the federal government using a firearm, you are facing a maximum penalty of life in federal prison." Ross grabbed Whitaker by the collar of his expensive black robes and hauled him to his feet. "Harlan Whitaker," Ross said, snapping cold steel handcuffs around the judge's wrists. "You have the right to remain silent. I highly suggest you finally use it." The perp walk was a masterpiece of karmic retribution. Within an hour, the local news vans had swarmed the courthouse steps. The FBI did not sneak Whitaker out the back door. They marched him right out the grand front entrance. The man who had spent 30 years looking down his nose at the citizens of Oak Haven County was paraded before them, his hands cuffed behind his back, his black robe stripped away to reveal a sweat-stained dress shirt. The cameras flashed blindingly. Reporters shouted questions, thrusting microphones over the police barricades. "Judge Whitaker, did you plant evidence? Harlan, is it true you targeted minorities?" Whitaker kept his head down, his silver hair disheveled, completely humiliated. He was shoved into the back of an unmarked black SUV, the heavy door slamming shut with a final echoing thud. The processing at the federal building in the neighboring city was mercilessly bureaucratic. Whitaker was stripped of his custom-tailored suit, his expensive watch, and his dignity. He was issued a scratchy, oversized orange jumpsuit. He was fingerprinted, photographed, and treated with the exact same detached, clinical apathy he had subjected thousands of people to over his career. When the heavy iron door of his holding cell slammed shut, Whitaker flinched. The sound was deafening. He sat on the thin, rigid metal cot, staring at the concrete walls. It was exactly like the cell he had sent Marcus Ross to just days prior. The irony was a physical weight on his chest. Later that afternoon, a guard tapped on the glass. "You got a visitor, Harlan." Whitaker looked up, a glimmer of desperate hope in his eyes. He expected his high-powered defense attorney, someone from his country club, a political ally coming to bail him out. Instead, the door opened and his former public defender, Thomas Vance, the man who had represented Desmond Bradley, walked in. Vance carried a battered briefcase and wore a look of utter disgust. "Thomas," Whitaker rasped, standing up quickly. "Thank God. You have to help me. I need you to contact the appellate division. I need you to file an emergency motion for bail. The feds are overstepping. This is a witch hunt." Vance did not sit down. He just stared at the pathetic figure in the orange jumpsuit. "I am not here to represent you, Harlan," Vance said coldly. "I am here because the federal magistrate appointed me to deliver your charging documents as your personal assets have been frozen by the DOJ pending an investigation into your financial ties to the private prison system." Whitaker's knees buckled. "Frozen? They cannot do that." "They already did," Vance replied, tossing a thick stack of indictments onto the metal table. "It is all over the national news. The director of the FBI just held a press conference. They are launching a full Operation Broken Gavel-style audit of every single case you have presided over for the last 20 years. Every minority defendant you handed a maximum sentence to is getting their case reviewed. The DOJ Civil Rights Division is eating your legacy alive." Whitaker stared at the paperwork, his hands trembling. "And Nolan Briggs?" Whitaker whispered. Briggs flipped before the SUV even reached the federal building, Vance said, a hard edge of satisfaction in his voice. "He gave them everything. The planted guns, the fake drug drops, the kickbacks. He handed them your head on a silver platter for a reduced sentence." Vance turned to leave, his hand on the heavy steel door. He paused, looking back at the man who had tormented his clients for years. "You spent your whole life building a machine to crush people who could not fight back, Harlan," Vance said quietly. "Now you get to find out what it feels like when those gears start grinding you." The door slammed shut, the lock engaging with a heavy metallic clank. Whitaker was left completely alone in the cold, sterile light of the cell. He curled up on the metal cot, the crushing weight of reality finally setting in. The apex predator was now the prey, and the justice system he had corrupted was about to swallow him whole. Months later, the Dirksen Federal Building in downtown Chicago had transformed into an impenetrable fortress of media and law enforcement. The spectacle surrounding Operation Broken Gavel had not simply endured. It had evolved into a nationwide obsession. For decades, the public had suspected that certain corners of the justice system were rigged, but they had never been offered such undeniable, high-definition proof. The sheer scale of the corruption unearthed in Oak Haven County was a masterclass in systemic abuse, but the undisputed crown jewel of the Department of Justice's prosecution was the man currently sitting at the defense table. Harlan Whitaker, the once feared apex predator of Courtroom 4, looked like a hollowed-out, pathetic shell of his former self. He had aged dramatically in those months. Stripped of his freedom, his power, and his access to his expensive barbers and tailor, his silver hair had grown wispy, thin, and unkempt. His custom $1,000 suits had been replaced by a standard, ill-fitting charcoal two-piece provided out of necessity by his defense team. Because his vast, ill-gotten assets had been immediately seized under federal RICO statutes, Whitaker was forced to rely on Leland Abernathy, a loud, perpetually sweating defense attorney who usually handled mid-level embezzlement cases, not disgraced, high-profile federal targets. Presiding over this monumental case was the Honorable Everett Harrison. Judge Harrison was a no-nonsense, deeply respected federal jurist who possessed absolutely zero patience for courtroom theatrics or bloated egos. The stark contrast between Judge Harrison's dignified, impartial command of the room and Whitaker's former dictatorial, racist tyranny was a poetic twist of fate that was not lost on anyone in the gallery. Leading the charge for the prosecution was Assistant United States Attorney Vanessa Sterling. Sterling was universally feared in the defense bar. She was a legal sniper. She did not yell, she did not posture for the cameras, and she did not waste words. She systematically dismantled her targets with a terrifying, quiet precision that left no room for reasonable doubt. Over the opening days of the trial, AUSA Sterling meticulously painted a harrowing picture of a county held hostage by a sadistic tyrant. She did not just tell the jury, she showed them. On the morning when the prosecution called their star corroborating witness, former Deputy Nolan Briggs was escorted to the witness stand wearing the bright orange jumpsuit of the Federal Bureau of Prisons, his wrists and ankles bound by heavy chains that clinked loudly in the absolute silence of the cavernous room. He looked terrified, completely broken by the federal system he had once manipulated for his own gain. Sterling approached the podium, adjusting her microphone. "Mr. Briggs," she began, her voice steady and echoing through the speakers. "Can you describe your professional relationship with the defendant, Harlan Whitaker?" Briggs swallowed hard, refusing to look at the defense table. I was his go-to guy. If he needed someone leaned on, if he needed a case to go a certain way to protect his conviction rates, he called me. And did that relationship extend to fabricating evidence? Sterling asked, her eyes locked onto the disgraced deputy. "Yes, ma'am," Briggs sobbed, wiping his nose with the back of his cuffed hand. The tough guy persona he had worn in Oak Haven County had completely evaporated. He ran the whole county like his own private kingdom. If you did not play ball, he would destroy your career. If he did not like a defendant, especially if they were black or Hispanic, he made sure they did not see the outside of a cell for a very long time. "Let us focus on the evening when the undercover sting took place," Sterling pressed. "Did the defendant explicitly order you to plant a .38 caliber revolver in the vehicle of the man you believed to be Desmond Bradley?" "Yes," Briggs whispered, his shoulders shaking. "He took it right out of his private safe. He told me to plant it under the dashboard. He said he wanted the defendant buried because he did not like his attitude. He told me to think of it as taking out the trash." At the defense table, Whitaker gripped his pen so hard his knuckles turned white. He glared at Briggs with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. But the jury, a diverse cross-section of the city that included the very demographics Whitaker had spent his life targeting, sat in stony silence. The disgust on their faces was palpable. They were watching a monster being unmasked by his own henchmen. But the fatal blow, the moment that cemented Whitaker's absolute ruin, came when Special Agent Marcus Ross finally took the stand. Dressed in a perfectly tailored navy blue suit, his posture impeccably straight, Ross projected an aura of absolute authority and competence. He was no longer the hunched, defeated Desmond Bradley in a torn jacket. He was the tip of the federal spear. He walked the jury through the meticulous planning of the undercover operation, his initial arrest on fabricated traffic charges, and the chilling, dehumanizing encounter he endured in courtroom 4. Then, AUSA. Sterling dimmed the courtroom lights. "Agent Ross," Sterling said, pressing a button on the master control podium. "Could you please direct the jury's attention to the monitors?" The massive high-definition screens mounted around the courtroom flared to life. The hidden fiber-optic camera footage captured from inside Whitaker's private chambers began to play. The audio was horrifyingly crystal clear, picking up the clinking of ice in bourbon glasses and the horrific, unfiltered racism that flowed freely from Harlan Whitaker's mouth. The jury watched, transfixed and thoroughly horrified, as the man who had sworn an oath to uphold the Constitution casually spun the dial on his heavy iron safe. They watched him pull out the .38 revolver wrapped in plastic. They listened to his deep, raspy voice echo through the courtroom speakers. 5 years is a vacation. I want him buried. I want him in a maximum security state penitentiary until his hair turns gray. We need an enhancement, a serious one. Think of it as community service. We are taking out the trash. When the lights slowly came back on, the silence in the courtroom was deafening. It was a heavy, suffocating silence. Whitaker was staring blankly at the defense table, his face entirely devoid of blood. The prosecution rested its case immediately after the tape finished playing. There was nothing left to say. The evidence was irrefutable. Any rational defense attorney would have immediately begun drafting an emergency plea deal, hoping to spare their client from spending his final decades in a concrete box. Leland Abernathy frantically whispered exactly that into Whitaker's ear. But Whitaker's narcissism, the exact same arrogant, blinding hubris that had led him to plant evidence on a federal agent in the first place, refused to let him surrender quietly. Against the frantic, pleading advice of his legal counsel, Whitaker invoked his right to testify. He genuinely believed he could charm the jury. He believed his decades of authority would shine through, that he could outsmart the federal prosecutor and somehow justify his monstrous actions to the world. It was the greatest, most devastating mistake of his entire life. Abernathy's direct examination of his client was painful to watch. Whitaker sat in the witness box trying to project his old booming voice of authority, claiming he was a dedicated public servant who had simply suffered a momentary lapse in judgment due to the overwhelming stress of an overcrowded docket. He attempted to paint himself as a victim of federal entrapment. When Abernathy mercifully sat down, AUSA Sterling slowly stood up. She did not look angry. She did not look rushed. She looked like a predator observing a cornered rat. She approached the podium holding a single, thin manila folder. "Mr. Whitaker," Sterling began, her voice ringing with terrifying clarity. "You just testified under oath that this incident was a momentary lapse in judgment brought on by the stress of your demanding job. Is that an accurate representation of your testimony?" "That is correct," Whitaker said, adjusting his cheap tie, jutting his chin out in a pathetic display of defiance. "I am human, Miss Sterling. I make mistakes, but my 30-year record of keeping the violent elements of my community off the streets speaks for itself. Let us talk about that specific record," Sterling said softly, opening the manila folder. "Let us talk about the .38 caliber revolver you handed to Deputy Briggs. You claimed earlier that you confiscated it from a dangerous individual and simply forgot to log it. The FBI crime lab ran the serial number despite it being poorly filed off. Do you know where that gun came from, Harlan?" Whitaker's jaw tightened. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple. "I handle thousands of pieces of evidence. I have no recollection of that specific weapon's origin." "Really?" Sterling took a deliberate step closer to the witness box, her eyes boring into him, because the federal evidence log tells a very different story. That gun was originally logged into your county's evidence room exactly 4 years ago during a gang-related homicide trial, a trial over which you personally presided. A loud murmur rippled through the gallery. Judge Harrison banged his gavel once, restoring immediate silence. I do not recall," Whitaker stammered, his confident facade beginning to crack under the immense pressure. "Let me refresh your memory," Sterling fired back, pulling a piece of paper from the folder and displaying it on the projector. "This is an official court order dated 4 years ago. It mandates that this specific .38 caliber revolver be slated for permanent destruction. And whose signature is at the bottom of this destruction order, Mr. Whitaker?" Whitaker stared at the screen, his mouth opening and closing wordlessly. It was his signature, bold, looping, and undeniable. "You did not confiscate it off the street, Harlan," Sterling continued, her voice rising in volume and power, echoing off the high ceilings. You stole it from your own evidence locker. You signed an order to destroy it, and then you quietly slipped it into your pocket. You kept it in your private safe as a drop piece, a designated tool specifically kept to illegally frame individuals who dared to look at you the wrong way. A tool to destroy lives. So I ask you, under penalty of perjury, how many other times did you use it? Objection! Badgering the witness! Abernathy shouted, half standing, his face flushed with panic. Overruled! Judge Harrison snapped immediately, leaning forward over his bench. The witness will answer the question. I never used it before. Whitaker practically screamed, his voice cracking violently. The remnants of his pride shattered into a million pieces for the entire world to see. The FBI entrapped me. They sent a professional liar into my courtroom to trick me into doing this. They did not trick you into being a racist, Mr. Whitaker, Sterling countered, her tone dropping back to a lethal, icy calm. They did not trick you into stealing a firearm from a homicide case. They did not trick you into conspiring to steal 20 years of an innocent man's life. They simply gave you enough rope, and you eagerly, enthusiastically tied the noose yourself. Sterling snapped the manila folder shut. The sound echoed like a gunshot. No further questions, Your Honor. Whitaker sat frozen in the witness box, physically trembling, entirely exposed. The monster had been dragged out of the dark, stripped of his black robes, and in the harsh, unforgiving light of the federal courtroom, he was nothing more than a pathetic, cowardly old man who had finally run out of places to hide. The jury deliberation took a short time. In a federal civil rights trial featuring mountain upon mountain of digitized evidence, audio recordings, and the damning testimony of a co-conspirator, it was less of a deliberation and more of a mere formality. The 12 men and women did not need to debate the complex nuances of the law. They had seen the absolute monster hiding behind the black robe, and they were eager to lock him in a cage. When the bailiff announced that the jury had reached a verdict, the tension inside the Dirksen Federal Building could have cut through solid steel. Harlan Whitaker stood at the defense table, his hands trembling so violently that they rattled against the polished mahogany. His breath came in shallow, ragged gasps, his face a sickly shade of ash. The foreperson of the jury, a middle-aged black woman who worked as a high school principal, stood up. She did not look at the judge or the prosecutors. She locked her eyes directly onto Harlan Whitaker, delivering the absolute, unfiltered consequence he had evaded for 30 years. On the count of deprivation of rights under color of law, we find the defendant Harlan Whitaker guilty. Whitaker flinched, his knees buckling slightly. On the count of conspiracy to defeat, obstruct, or impair the due administration of justice, we find the defendant guilty. A quiet collective gasp rippled through the packed gallery behind him. On the count of possession of a firearm in furtherance of a civil rights violation, we find the defendant guilty. Count after count, the word guilty struck Whitaker like physical, crushing blows to the chest. He collapsed back into his heavy wooden chair, completely ignoring his attorney's frantic whispers, and buried his face in his hands as a breathless sigh of relief washed over the room. Weeks later, sentencing day arrived. The atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted from tense anticipation to solemn closure. The wooden pews of the gallery were filled to absolute capacity. Sitting in the front rows were dozens of families, the mothers, fathers, and grown children of the men and women Whitaker had wrongfully imprisoned over his 3-decade reign of terror. One woman held a framed photograph of a son who had lost years of his life to one of Whitaker's fabricated charges. Thanks to Operation Broken Gavel, the Department of Justice was actively reviewing and overturning hundreds of Whitaker's tainted convictions. The long, painful healing of Oak Haven County had finally begun, but today was strictly about the butcher paying his debt. Judge Everett Harrison looked down from the elevated bench, his expression etched with profound, immovable disgust. He looked at Whitaker not as a peer, but as a deeply flawed, broken criminal. Harlan Whitaker, Judge Harrison began, his deep, resonant voice commanding absolute pin-drop silence in the cavernous room. The oath of a judge is a sacred trust. It is the very bedrock of our civilized society. When a citizen walks into a courtroom, they must fundamentally believe that the scales of justice are balanced. You took those scales, heavily weighted them with your own vile, racist prejudices, and used them to ruthlessly bludgeon the most vulnerable members of our society. Harrison leaned forward, clasping his hands tightly together, his eyes narrowing. You did not just break the law. You made a sickening mockery of it. You weaponized your authority to destroy human lives for your own sadistic pleasure simply because you felt entirely untouchable behind that bench. You thought you were the law, but today, you are violently reminded that no one, absolutely no one, escapes consequence. The justice system you manipulated is the exact same machine that will now process you. Judge Harrison picked up his heavy steel pen, signing the official irrevocable order. For your horrific crimes against the Constitution of the United States, and for the malicious, calculated attempt to destroy an innocent life using a stolen firearm, I sentence you to a total of 35 years in the custody of the Federal Bureau of Prisons. This sentence is to be served consecutively, without the possibility of parole, early release, or any leniency. You are remanded immediately. The deafening slam of Judge Harrison's gavel echoed off the walls. It was the definitive, terrifying sound of Harlan Whitaker's life coming to an abrupt end. The karma that followed was brutal, absolute, and profoundly poetic. Harlan Whitaker was not sent to a minimum security, white-collar country club prison to play tennis with embezzlers. Because of his background in law enforcement and the high-profile, malicious nature of his civil rights violations, the Bureau of Prisons designated him to USP Beaumont, a notoriously violent, high-security federal penitentiary in the sweltering humidity of Texas. There, Whitaker was entirely stripped of his title, his dignity, and his humanity. He stepped off the transport bus, shackled at the wrists, waist, and ankles. He became inmate number 448-92079. For his own safety, he was placed in a specialized protective custody unit, surrounded by disgraced former cops, violent cartel informants, and the very types of hardened criminals he used to casually sneer at from his elevated bench. His new permanent kingdom was an 8-by-10-foot concrete box. It featured a freezing steel toilet, a paper-thin mattress that smelled of bleach and sweat, and a single frosted slit of a window that barely let in the Texas sun. The arrogant apex predator, who had once commanded total, terrified obedience from everyone in his orbit, now spent his days pushing a dirty mop bucket down sterile, echoing hallways. He endured the cold, unblinking indifference of federal guards who treated him exactly like the garbage he used to take out. The man who had silenced so many now lived in a world where his own voice meant absolutely nothing. He had no power, no appeals left, and absolutely no future outside those concrete walls. Meanwhile, back in Oak Haven County, the heavy, oppressive oak doors of Courtroom 4 were physically ripped off their hinges and replaced with modern transparent glass. A new judge, a brilliant former civil rights attorney named Elena Collins, took the bench, ushering in an era of genuine transparency and fairness. And Special Agent Marcus Ross? He simply packed his duffel bag, filed his final paperwork, and completely vanished back into the shadows. He was a silent, lethal guardian of justice, already moving on to his next undercover mission, leaving the broken pieces of Harlan Whitaker's empire far behind him. If this story of absolute, undeniable karma made your blood boil and your heart cheer, you are definitely in the right place. The justice system has its deep flaws. But when the corrupt are finally dragged kicking and screaming into the light, the satisfaction is absolutely incredible. No one is above the law. And Harlan Whitaker learned that reality the hardest way imaginable, trading his expensive robes for a concrete cell.